Hi all. Okay, so I think we're going to get started. I just want to say if you have any questions, please put them in the chat with your name and your outlet, and we're going to prioritize press first. And we will take it from there. You can add questions while this is happening or at the end. Susan, I turn it to you to kick it off.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susan Lerner, and I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York. I'm pleased to be joined by Andrew Hoppin, the former and first Chief Information Officer for the New York State Senate. Andrew set up many of the Senate systems that have made it a more transparent and open body, and we're grateful to him for sharing his expertise today. The legislature is a co-equal branch of government that cannot and should not cede its role to the executive, which is correctly triaging the current state of emergency. While the governor is figuring out how to get 30,000 ventilators and literally keep New Yorkers alive, lawmakers need to look beyond the rapidly evolving crisis and help plan for recovery in addition to supporting their constituents. As Andrew will explain in more depth, we have the technology to make remote and virtual legislative voting possible, as well as hold committee meetings, public hearings, and record minutes. Other states, like Pennsylvania, have already done so. Nothing about this situation is ideal, but democracy does not pause, it evolves, and it adapts. Just like the largest school system in the country and hundreds of service providers, organizations, corporations, and nonprofits across New York State have adapted to work remotely. There are many important policy items that may not and should not get done as part of the New York State budget, which lawmakers must address after the fact. For instance, we should have the legislature address expanded absentee voting. Take that off the governor's plate. It's fairly detailed. And the issue of bail reform, which has been so controversial. Now, folks who believe these recently adopted reforms should be changed, and people who believe it's premature to examine it are now both in agreement that that should not be part of the budget discussion. It should be taken up later. Some New Yorkers need lawmakers to commit to staying remotely in session post-budget to continue the people's business. And we are here to explain how they can. Which is why I am so pleased that Andrew is here to join us. Andrew.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to be pulled into this conversation because we laid a lot of groundwork way back in circa 2010 in the New York State Senate when I was the Chief Information Officer there for remote work. And we did it at the time in order to help make it so you didn't need to be in Albany to know what was going on in Albany. And that was good, obviously, for the majority of New Yorkers that don't live in Albany, but it's also good for the elected officials who wanted to spend as much time as possible back in their districts. So we did things like rolling out Wi-Fi in all Senate offices, including in districts, giving Senate iPads to the senators, live streaming all of the proceedings of the Senate, and most importantly, in my view, freeing the data that is fundamental to the process of making laws so that it could be accessed on the web and so that contemporary software applications could be built using that data. So no longer did you have to actually be in Albany or on the Senate's private information network in order to be able to engage in the lawmaking process or know what was going on. So that's great groundwork. It was just built already for a different purpose. And the key point for me today is that not only do we have that groundwork, but we have really sophisticated technology teams in the Senate and the Assembly. And I have full confidence that they're competent to take both those foundational tools that we put in place some time ago, as well as simple off-the-shelf tools like the one that we're using right now, Zoom, and to be able to meld those together with perhaps some updated policies and procedures for parliamentary process in a manner that could allow the institution to continue to function, albeit in a distributed fashion, really without missing a beat. And we are seeing examples of this in other legislatures, certainly at local city council levels. And I think the key take home for me is that it's really about the parliamentary policies and procedures and modernizing those, not about a technological barrier to actually operating remotely. And I would even posit that some of these updates we may make, both to technology tools and parliamentary procedures, motivated by this crisis, could actually be opportunities to further streamline the work of these elected bodies after this crisis is over. And we may go from streaming to streamlining in ways that actually could be a good opportunity rather than just a sort of patch together a solution to a crisis. So I'd like to look at the opportunity aspect of this, as well as the necessity for, in my view, elected bodies to continue to function at full pace during this crisis.
Andrew, thank you. I'm sure that the press representatives that we have on the call have questions, and we would be happy to hear from you.
Sure, so if you have any questions, you can drop your name and your outlet in the chat and we'll get to you. Or I'm happy to unmute as well. And if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself.
So I hope that, you know, obviously our message is clear. There don't seem to be any questions. You know, the technology exists, and we definitely want the legislature to utilize its skilled staff and to figure out the appropriate way to continue to operate remotely.
Susan Arbiter has a question. Feel free, Susan, to unmute yourself and you can ask. Or
hi. Okay, it just took me a second. You mentioned that the technological barriers aren't the ones that are going to prevent this from happening. What may prevent it from happening are some procedural and parliamentary barriers. Can you share what some of those are, or is that beyond your wheelhouse?
So it is certainly beyond my wheelhouse. I'm not the parliamentarian, and I am some years out of date on some of the aspects. But I have checked in with former colleagues and refreshed my understanding of just some anecdotal examples. Like I believe the requirement to still print bills and put them on the desks of senators and assembly people is still in force. And so the need to print a lot of paper, I think, was long thought to be a bit of an anachronism in the institution even before this crisis, and obviously is a pragmatic barrier to passing bills in an efficient manner today when we need to be able to work remotely. So that's just one example. Digital signatures, I think, are also at issue in various parts of the workflow, meaning that a need for a handwritten signature, again, may seem like an anachronism, but my understanding is that some of our policies, procedures, and even laws have not been updated to accommodate the ability to digitally sign documents in a way that has legal force.
So, you know, both houses have begun to address this issue, which is the resolutions that have been passed by the Senate on Sunday and passed by the Assembly on Monday that allow for remote voting. But for instance, we're hearing that there are issues, as Andrew said, in terms of signing documents. Right now, the system requires a signature for somebody to co-sponsor a bill, an actual physical signature. Well, that's a problem right now. And there are various bills which have been introduced and are being discussed that address things like, for instance, expanded absentee voting. So how do you get somebody to be a co-sponsor? These are all things which need to be really addressed by, I think, as Andrew points out, going forward, but also in this emergency situation. And for instance, one of the oddities of the resolution actually passed by the Assembly is that it appears, as the Republicans in the Assembly have pointed out, that it requires anybody who wants to vote no on a bill which is up before the body to actually be physically present in the chamber. That kind of anachronistic thinking really needs to change. And the technology exists. And we are here to urge both houses of the legislature to embrace it, to streamline, as Andrew said, not just for this emergency, but going forward, and basically to help in any way that we can in getting them to think through the right procedures to be able to continue to do the people's business in a way that allows New Yorkers to feel confident that their elected representatives are doing what needs to be done to help the state recover.
Thank you, Susan. Any other questions?
I have another question.
Great.
What are some of the other bills that, or the issues, Susan Lerner, that you would like to see the legislature not deal with in the budget, but deal with post-budget?
Well, for instance, we know that the entire idea of legalizing marijuana, which could be a revenue generator for the state, we understand has fallen out of the budget. That is definitely something that could be taken up post-budget. The entire question of rent and housing remains very much on the minds of people who suddenly find that their income has disappeared overnight. All of the ins and outs of expanding absentee voting. There's the Biaggi bill, which would clarify that you can apply for an absentee ballot because of a fear of becoming sick or making somebody else sick. We need the legislature to step in and allow people to apply for absentee ballots through email and by fax and by phone. Bail reform is something that I mentioned previously, and there are a host of issues which I think we may not even be aware of that will develop, where social service agencies dealing with this crisis are going to find that they're going to need assistance in changes in laws and in redirecting the state's attention going forward in ways that we can't yet anticipate, but that will become more obvious as the crisis evolves.
I would also just add from my perspective that, one of the things we try to do in the legislative technology world is facilitate efficiency and agility. And I think that's never been more at issue than now. In other words, what might have seemed like a good idea last week may not seem like a good idea next week. And how can you update, not only perhaps policies by executive mandate, but really ultimately law when it's needed in a more streamlined fashion. And I think some of the changes to the workflows that are not just about enabling the distancing that's required physically by elected officials today, but also just to further streamline the workflows of making laws, I think, again, will be useful during this time, but also potentially of great benefit going forward after this crisis is over in terms of the responsiveness of our elected bodies to the needs of New Yorkers for a long time to come.
Okay, I'll give it another minute or so. Anyone? Oh, Susan, Arbiter, feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, if somebody else has a question, please just interrupt me. But I was talking to some lawmakers from the Assembly yesterday, and they said that, it was 5 hours on Saturday over Zoom with, 100 of their fellow conference members and 9 hours on Sunday or something. And they didn't get anything done because it's too many people on a Zoom call. So how do you address, having conference when you do have so many disparate views and just frankly, so many people?
That's a really good question. I've been on calls, national calls with over 80 people where we were trying to discuss policy. And I think that there are various ways in which it can be done. There are breakout rooms that you can have in Zoom and in Google Chat. You can, rely on smaller groupings to have discussions and then come back and report to the whole. And Andrew, you're nodding, and I bet you have some ideas as well.
Yeah, so simple off-the-shelf tools that are affordable and that work for in a pinch like Zoom, I think are really useful, and particularly city councils are using that to great effect because the scale there and the complexity of the workflows it tends to be more modest. That said, there are very sophisticated suites of tools designed to run meetings, including in hybridized ways where there are some people in person and some people remote, especially constituents participating remotely in legislative committee hearings that are very mature and well built out. There are entire suites of tools for remote voting for remote public comment, for indexing the live streams of video by keywords so you can search and sort for what you're looking for. And so, yes, those involve, vendor solutions, or procurement and money and all those things. In some cases, installing equipment in buildings if you want to support the in-person version of this. But I think a lot of those tools, to the extent that they haven't yet been adopted by our elected bodies, are worth looking at as well. Again, fortunately in New York, I think we have a sophisticated technology operation relative to many state legislatures, such that we have some optionality here. We have the ability to look to vendor solutions that are purpose-built to support a lot of people collaborating remotely, including in formal parliamentary processes. We also have the ability to build our own tools and to at least customize off-the-shelf tools to our specific needs when they're specific to the way that our legislative bodies work. So we're in a fortunate position, and I really, somewhat parochially, having been formally, on the administrative staff side of the Senate now a decade ago, I think we should really ask those staff people who are real domain experts and very creative and very sophisticated how they would solve these problems, and give them the agency to say, you know what, this vendor solution looks great, or we think we can build our own tool for this, or we can customize an off-the-shelf tool for this. And while those administrative staff can't lobby for policy changes, which is a good thing, they are certainly domain experts in terms of where there may be new opportunities for new efficiencies, and I think they should be asked.
And, Susan, without a doubt, this isn't ideal. Everybody is going to have to adapt, but as Andrew points out, there are tools that can be used. And, our purpose today is to urge the legislature, as Andrew says, to authorize the staff to explore solutions and to be creative and to take advantage of the technology and technical expertise that New York has, both in-house and, in the rest of the state. We need them to do the people's business, and we're sure that they can use the tools to do it.
All right, any last questions? Susan, Arbiter, also fine if you have another follow-up question, but open up to anyone else. Okay, well, I appreciate everyone for getting up on the call. We'll be putting out a press release that I'll make sure all of you guys get shortly. And you can always follow up with any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you all. And thanks again, Andrew. Stay safe.
Thank you all.